It was always a self-aware genre.
Like they're riding on a horse. They're climbing up the top of a pyramid.
Absolutely. That's kind of maybe the main defining feature of Blanc that carries over from Poirot.
Hello and welcome all to Screen Rant's Challenge My Goat. My name is Todd Gilchrist and I am your sleuth hound through this show of superlatives. Today's topic is the greatest murder mystery of all time. Our expert today is writer and director Rian Johnson. To save him from having to sing his own praises, allow me to detail what makes him qualified to choose the greatest murder mystery of all time. He's the creator of the Knives Out films, which are themselves three of the greatest mysteries of modern filmmaking. The latest in this series, Wake Up Dead Man, is open in limited theatrical release now and debuts on Netflix on December 12th. It's my favorite of the three films. But for our Challenge My Goat podcast, Ryan says he thinks there's a better murder mystery in film history. Ryan, what film could you possibly think is better than your own in this genre?
That sounds like a Gilbert and Sullivan lyric, a better film mystery in all of film history. So my choice is the 1978, I believe, Death on the Nile, starring Peter Ustinov. And if there is kind of a pleasure center for me cinematically and mystery movie-wise that all of these Benoit Blanc mysteries are trying to hit, it's located right in the middle of Death on the Nile. And I think there was sort of a run that began with Albert Finney in Murder on the Orient Express of all-star cast, big extravaganza, Agatha Christie adaptation murder mysteries. And to me, my favorite of those, and it continued with Evil Under the Sun, which I also adore. And then there were several others kind of going into the 80s. For me, the height of all of it was Death on the Nile. It has an extraordinary cast who are all having the time of their lives. It has a beautiful, beautiful photography and actually on location photography. It has a great mystery that is centered on just this wonderful love triangle story that immediately grabs you and pulls you in. Mia Farrow is absolutely stellar in this movie. And there's a running relationship between her and Poirot that is really beautiful and kind of heartbreaking. And the movie is also very funny. It's very fun. It plays fair with the mystery. It uses the language of cinema to tell the mystery. The fact that when Poirot is kind of accusing each of the people, it flashes to kind of an actual scene where you see how they could have done it, I think is something that's fantastic. So I don't know, just all around the absolute GOAT of murder mystery adaptations in my book.
You highlighted the fact that this film has a literal and metaphorical murderer's row cast, this incredible pedigree behind the camera. How much of that film's greatness do you think is due to Agatha Christie, who wrote the original novel? How much is it sort of elevated or perhaps improved upon by John Guillermin as the director? You have, GOAT cinematographer Jack Cardiff, on this ensemble cast.
Did Anthony Shaffer write the screenplay for this one? I think maybe look that up.
Yeah,
I think he did.
Yes,
I believe he did, and he also. I mean, it's a great novel. It's a fantastic novel, and all the things that make the movie work are there in the novel. So it's not a thing of they really kind of elevated it with this thing with this film. I think they really just tapped into what makes Christie's work great. But there is a level on which this movie is working where it's aware of the Hollywood spectacle of it. It's aware of the fact that they're putting on a big show, that it's aware of the fact that they have, they got Betty Davis, it knows that it's kind of a big Hollywood event. And there's something tremendously fun about that element. So Anthony Shaffer, who was, he wrote the play Sleuth and adapted it, and the version of it that he adapted with Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine is one of my favorite films. And Shaffer was an incredibly And he was Peter Shaffer's brother. And I think it's pronounced Shaffer. Some people pronounce it Schaefer. I think it's Shaffer. But if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I apologize. And Peter Shaffer, who wrote Amadeus and who wrote Equus, but Anthony kind of did murder mysteries and was so smart and so savvy at it. And so, and the fact that he leads with this incredibly economic introduction of the heart of the movie, which is, the love triangle, at the heart of it. It's just so well done. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say that dissolve between, the one embrace to the wedding photo. That's the embrace with the different people is just so skillful.
It's perfect. And then, and then the scene on the pyramid where, the lovers are there. And also there's a shooting on a pyramid and they're actually like riding horses up to the pyramid. It's like real location photography in a way that, it's not like it's not some kind of like recreation of it. It's pretty extraordinary. It's gorgeous.
Sure. Well, given how great this movie is, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious how this film in particular may have influenced or inspired Wake Up Dead Man, either as you were writing or directing it, given sort of that element of that Hollywood spectacle, the complexity of the mystery, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, my memories with this movie specifically, this and Orient Express, my memories of sitting in front of the TV with my whole family, watching a VHS copy from the rental store of this movie and everybody being into it. And, that influenced the thing generally. Specifically, I mean, there's a little bit of crossover. There's maybe a little bit more, I don't know, because in some ways it's like Glass Onion in that it's a big kind of destination mystery. But tonally, it does have some darker things in it that are similar to Wake Up Dead Man. And it's one of the scariest shots for me as a kid. There's a shot that's like inside the boat where I think there's a little conversation that happens and then Poirot leaves and then it kind of, the camera zooms in on this dark screen and, Bette Davis's character kind of like her face kind of like emerges from the darkness and it's this just creepy, wonderful. And there's a sense of dread throughout the entire movie. It's really rooted in this sense of dread and impending doom. There's a wonderful visual sequence, where they're all kind of like walking silently through this ancient temple. And, it's a tension thing because there's, somebody's going to actually like push this big stone off and try and attempt to kill somebody. And it's this wonderful conceptual little set piece of a sequence where it's just silent and just all the different little groups of people walking through these massive pillars. And that for me, it's like, it's not just like crackling dialogue. It's not just like clues and everything. It also takes the moment to have this kind of Hitchcock style little gem of a sequence in it, which for me is like, okay, these movies can kind of attempt anything.
Sure. Well, Peter Ustinov gives such a great performance as Poirot, so much so that he obviously reprised the role several times after that. But I was watching this and I definitely see some parallels between his sort of sense of intellectual superiority, his sort of enjoying of, playing like a cat and mouse, over the suspects, between him and Benoit Blanc. Can you talk about sort of how that whether it's this film or just in general, how you like that element to inject it into your detective?
Yeah, I mean, Ustinov is my favorite of the Poirots, and it's and this is amongst a lot of great Poirot perform. I mean, obviously Finney, but also David Suchet. Also, I love Kenneth Branagh's Poirot. I think he's fantastic in that character, and but Ustinov is my favorite. I think it is because he's incredibly smart, but what he gets that I always felt reading Agatha Christie's books, he also gets what's funny about Poirot. He gets the slight the self-regard, the slight tinge of clownishness about him. Cause I think Christie thinks Poirot is quite funny. And so Ustinov really dives into that element of it, while still being able to land again, I keep coming back to his relationship with Mia Farrow's character throughout the course of it. You can get the sense of his wisdom still. Kind of the comic nature of it doesn't preclude that. So yeah, and absolutely, that's kind of maybe the main defining feature of Blanc that carries over from Poirot.
Sure. Well, I'm curious if within the world of Benoit Blanc, is that a world where Poirot as a literary figure or a real person, does he exist? Is the antecedent of Benoit, this reading this guy on the page? Is it a person who's a actual detective in real life who inspired him?
Well, we know that Poirot exists. I name check. There's in Wake Up Dead Man, there's a book club that everyone's reading, and Murder at the Vicarage is in the book club. And so is Roger Ackroyd, which is one of my favorite Poirot mysteries. But Poirot definitely exists. I mean, I like to think that the Blanc is probably slightly annoyed whenever anyone brings up Poirot around him, the same way that Poirot would be slightly annoyed when anyone brings up Sherlock Holmes, I think. And this is another element of, this is not really represented in the movie, but in Christie's books and in a lot of Golden Age detective fiction, even back at the very inception of the genre, it was always a self-aware genre. It was always a genre that was specifically calling out the fact that, oh, this is just like a murder mystery book. And, oh, you're playing Sherlock Holmes here, aren't you, Poirot? And, oh, it was, and they were constantly name checking each other in terms of the authors and referencing each other. So this is a genre that's always slightly cheekily aware of the fact that it is, the fact of its own existence, I think. Yeah.
Sure. In rewatching Death on the Nile for this conversation, what was interesting for me was how my expectation that there was going to be a murderer made everything the characters did seem kind of vaguely dangerous. It's like they're riding on a horse, they're climbing on the top of a pyramid. All these things seemed, I'm just like, was it going to happen? When's it going to happen? I feel like almost by comparison, you seem to almost go in the opposite direction and kind of lull the audience into maybe a almost false sense of comfort before the murder happens in your film. Is there a reason that you like that, if you call it misdirection, or that sort of, delayed gratification?
Well, I think the audience is always going to be bringing that to the table with these movies. And I think that's part of the thing I've kind of learned over the course of writing a few of them, is you don't really have to pedal in terms of building that anticipation. That's going to be there. The same way that you don't really have to plant misdirection. You don't have to plant red herrings. You don't have to get clever in that way, because the audience is much more clever than you to begin with, and they're going to be bringing their own kind of, what about this, what about that, to the table. They're going to be watching everything like a hawk. So, and for me also, the notion of kind of, with Wake Up Dead Man, for example, having a first act before Blanc enters, where we do get kind of pulled in, hopefully, to the story of Father Judd trying to make his place in this church, and the conflict of him versus Josh Brolin's character, Monsignor Wicks, and the rest of the idea that we dramatically get caught up in that, and then the murder kind of hits and kind of jars us. That to me is wonderful, because that's the only type of misdirection I kind of know how to do that works, I think. Misdirection in terms of trying to outsmart the audience of, oh, maybe it's this that happened, or maybe it's that, is never going to, I think, work. The only misdirection that actually works is dramatically involving the audience. I actually think Death on the Nile does that in a great way with the with the whole tension between, in the love triangle of Mia Farrow kind of getting increasingly more dramatic and unhinged over the course of it, and us feeling sympathy for her, but also feeling, how is this going to resolve?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when you're writing your stories, do you tend to work from one end or another? I mean, do you work backwards from the murder? Do you work backwards from the culprit? Do you, or how do you sort of, where's the starting point for you with one of your mysteries?
So I don't work from the beginning or end, really. I work zoomed back. I write very structurally. And so I'll spend the first 80% of the process in notebooks, just kind of figuring out the shape of the whole thing, figuring out the bigger dramatic arc, figuring out how the theme plays out from the beginning to the end, and really thinking big picture. So it's not like I start with whodunit, but at the same time, starting zoomed back, you start with who the protagonist is, what they want, why can't they get it, how do they get it at the end in a way that they don't expect. You start with the basic building blocks of a good story. And then that very quickly informs, okay, that means the murder mystery has to serve that big dramatic arc. And that means it makes sense that this type of person did. Okay, so if we create a character as that type of person, and then you start zooming in piece by piece kind of and figuring the whole thing out.
Sure. What do you know about Christie's methods of sort of concocting mysteries, and how much, if any, kind of inspiration or how many similarities maybe do you have between her approach and yours?
The one thing I know is that she came up with a lot of her plots while she was doing dishes. I know she's grand about that, but I can relate. I know that because that's why I like to drive around LA. I feel like having something that you're doing with that in playing music and just kind of your head is elsewhere and it kind of comes to you. So I get that element of it. In terms of how she actually constructed it, that I don't know. I'd be very curious to hear that. But also, I think everyone everyone has their own way of doing it.
Sure. Well, Death on the Nile features these really interesting sort of concentric circles of culpability. Some suspects more likely than others. When you're writing your mysteries, do you like to depict your characters or imagine them as all equally potentially guilty or all equally potentially innocent? Or how do you look at them that way at all?
Yeah, you have to know how each of them could have done it, but more importantly, why each of them would be driven to do it. And you have to, at some point, do a pass on them where you feel like, okay, they did it, and what are they hiding? But at the same time, it's I don't know, the bigger challenge, that though you can kind of figure out, the bigger challenge is, or the starting point for a big group of suspects is they all have to feel very distinct. And they all have to, not just in terms of their physical type or what they sound like or anything like that, they all have to have a different angle in on the main central theme of the whole movie. And a different motive, basically, which Death on the Nile also does very, very well. And so in that way, you have to you have to get inside each one of their heads. For me, it's a big thing is also starting each of the suspects from kind of a place of empathy as a writer, figuring out what I relate to in each one of them. And I think Christie does that great too. And Shaffer does that very well with this adaptation. I feel like, every single one of the people, you have a certain degree of sympathy for them, and you like all the suspects in a weird way, even if some of them are despicable.
Death of the Nile, the film and the story is built almost exclusively around the murder. You talk about it having these darker elements and these other elements, but it really is about that murder and solving it. But your film, and this is one of the things that made me really respond to it, is that your film uses the murder story almost as a device. For you, when you obviously, it's clear from the 3 films that you've made that you like approaching them differently, meaning like the use. But, for you, how tough is it to balance the demands of a whodunit to provide that intrigue and excitement and mystery while you're still exploring these other themes? In this case, you talked about the fact that your own sort of spiritual journey fed into Judd's and, sort of the idea of what a murder mystery can mean. Can you talk about sort of how you balance the two halves of that sort of equation?
Yeah, I guess my own approach to it with this movie specifically, and kind of with all 3 of them, but definitely with this one, is I never approach it in terms of well, here's the movie that I actually want to make, and then how do I kind of put a mystery story on top of that? I don't approach it as two halves. To me, I can only really start working when I feel like the thing that I want to talk about and the genre, in this case, the notion of a whodunit genre, go like this and inform and feed off of each other. One of my favorite moments in this movie is there's a moment at the end when Blanc is up on the pulpit at the church, and Kaylee Spaney's character kind of in tears because she so desperately both needs to believe, needs to have faith, needs to believe, needs answers, needs healing. She shouts to them, "Can't you just give us the answers and what that would all this is for?" And they're in the church, and the fact that then speaks exactly to the overlap of it speaks to why we watch murder mysteries. It also speaks to why we go to church and why we are searching for faith in our lives. And so for me, it can never be kind of two halves that are seeking balance. It always has to be one idea that both of these two things serve, and they become sort of inseparable in the telling.
Well, listen, with just a handful of minutes left, is there anything else about Death on the Nile that makes you love it so much? You've spoken very, passionately about all these different elements. Is there anything else that you haven't mentioned that makes you love it so much or declare it the greatest murder mystery of all time?
I mean, I think the fact that it's so effective on every single level, and it is also so much fun. I think that's the other element of it is, and I mean, Evil Under the Sun was campier, and Murder on the Orient Express was maybe more kind of atmospheric. But this one strikes a balance between, it really sits in between those two, and for me strikes the perfect balance. And at its heart, though, it is just an absolute blast. And the movie is aware of the fact that we're all here to have a good time at the end of the day. And so even the kind of the darker melodramatic parts of it are leaning into it in a way that's delicious. And that is kind of the heart of sort of, I don't know, it's why I wanted to make the movies that I'm making right now. It's the heart of kind of what these things should always be. Even when they're dark in a way that's having a absolute blast leaning into that.
Sure. I was honestly surprised when you told me it was going to be Death on the Nile, because I know you're such a fan of The Last of Sheila. I'm curious if there are other films you recommend, not as homework, of course, for your films, but just what that you see as complementary works that you think people would enjoy or maybe see. Maybe they would see some of your tricks at work, if they watch them after Wake Up Dead Man.
Well, there's some films that are, that are very, very different than Wake Up Dead Man, but that have some degree of connection to it. There's a great British whodunit called Green for Danger that is set in World War II, and it's kind of like it's like a medical mystery drama, and it's something that's a little less well known, but it's an absolute delight. There's also, honestly, this movie. Martin McDonagh's movie, The Banshees, Inisherin, that was a kind of an influence on the tone of this. But his brother made a movie called Calvary with Brendan Gleeson that, and during the research part of this, a lot of the priests that I talked to, a lot of like young American priests that I was talking to and kind of interviewing and just for research on the Catholic side of everything, called that out as being their favorite movie about a priest. Which is wild because it is not a gentle, tender, faith-based movie. It is a very dark and twisted, small town kind of sort of semi-mystery that goes pretty hard at the the abuse scandal centered in Catholic Ireland, and it's a pretty extraordinary film.
Wow. Well, to our listeners, if you disagree with Ryan's GOAT selection, head over to screenrant.com to challenge our My GOAT article series and let us know your pick in the comments. And if you make a compelling argument that we will read it on the show next week, perhaps. Next week, we will be tackling the GOAT James Cameron movie. Ryan, do you have a favorite James Cameron movie?
The first Terminator. And I love all his movies. I think all his movies are masterpieces. And I think the first Terminator is just an absolute perfect movie. And it's also inspiring to just seeing on a relatively low budget with a perfect script and just absolutely diamond cut storytelling instincts, what you can accomplish. It's an extraordinary movie.
Well, maybe we don't need to do the one next week after all, since Ryan just figured it out.
Good luck.
So
follow that. Done. Done.
Well, listen, that was incredible. Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything you'd like to throw in for a last plug for Wake Up Dead Man? Is this being released, in theaters and online?
Go see Wake Up Dead Man. See it in a theater. There's, if you look at any of my social media stuff, I have like a site that is a link to find a theater. And I know it's fairly limited, but they're kind of spread across the country. So see if it's playing near you. Hope you like it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, readers, for joining us. We'll see you next week.